Want to tell me a little bit about just who you are and your role in the history of the disability rights movement?
So I'm a 72-and-a-half-year-old white disabled woman, and at the moment I'm wearing a pink sweater, sitting in a motorized wheelchair, and we are in a very lovely area in my neighborhood in Washington, D.C., which is called Klingle Path. I give my age in part because I'm one of the older surviving disabled people in the movement today, and as such, I really have lived through a period of time where we went from having basically no local, I grew up in New York, local, state, or national laws to now where we have many very important pieces of national legislation, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and many other pieces of legislation. So we've really been able to move in a 70, 80, 90-year period of time from only looking at disability as a issue of medical and cure and not recognizing that we have rights and that discrimination was occurring. That's definitely, on paper, definitely has changed. There have been very important changes that have been made that are enabling disabled children and youth and those in higher education to actually go to programs where they're included in regular education and that they have a right to go to school. Those are all very important changes. Also, the physical environment itself has really been dramatically changed, not just in government buildings, but in the public and private sector, as has discrimination being made illegal in areas like employment in the public and private sector. We also are seeing the development of a cross-disability rights movement, which really did not exist when I was, first growing up. Doesn't exist yet the way it needs to exist, but definitely was one of the reasons why we were able to get the Section 504 regulations signed and why we were able to get the Americans with Disabilities Act passed in 1990. The ability of disabled people to come together to talk about issues of discrimination, to enable the Congress on the House and Senate side to see that the discrimination occurred in every state, in every district, that it was equivalent to other forms of discrimination in race and gender, and that we needed to have the same protections as others. So I think those are all very monumental changes.
I'm going to do two very quick things, okay? I'm going to bring my bag over here just so I can sit on it. I'm also just going to... Oh, okay.
It's much better.
So, Judy, talk a bit about, let's say, the movement work that went into, that happened during the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s that led to the ADA, and about how that was a consequence of also of the civil rights movement of that time.
So the 1964 Civil Rights Act did not include disability. And I think as more of us with disabilities were beginning to go to universities. I grew up in Brooklyn, so I speak about what was going on at that point in Brooklyn. We were coming together on college campuses and in summer camps. The Netflix film Crip Camp, I think, is a great example of a summer camp in Hunter, New York, and the power of disabled youth coming together to go to camp, ostensibly. No programming on the part of the camp itself to discuss issues of equity or justice or need of reform, but a time where we were being influenced by the civil rights movement that we were reading about and hearing about on radio and seeing on television, and the demonstrations, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the anti-war movement, many things that were going on in the 60s that we as campers then were beginning to think about our lives and our futures, and how disability at that point, like today, is still noticeably absent in much of the discourse that's going on around injustice. And we began to think about not only what the barriers were, but about what we would be able to do to remove those barriers. And that, I think, was the very important part of my life and the lives of my friends, that we began to envision not just that we were faced with problems, but that we began to discuss the problems as acts of discrimination. I think it was much more powerful when we were able to really look at acts of discrimination, intentional discrimination, as opposed to a problem, which in many ways we then would think could be our problem. It wasn't our problem. We didn't cause it. And they were problems like lack of ramps or sign language interpreters or Braille, or exclusion of people who had intellectual disabilities being placed in institutions, or psychosocial disabilities. Those were not the individual problems. That was the collective view of society. So our ability to really work together from a cross-disability perspective, as I'm saying, moving it from an individual problem to a collective act of discrimination, really helped move forward the work that we were doing in all the major legislation at that time, but Section 504 in the 1970s and the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, I think were particularly impacted by the cross-disability movement, because these are both pieces of legislation that make it illegal to discriminate against disabled people in a variety of areas. The resolutions may be different depending on the individual and the type of disability they may have. An individual may or may not need an accommodation, but blind people, deaf people, those with intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities, diabetes, mental health, on and on, are being able to come together and talk about both our personal stories of the discrimination that we were facing, how it was adversely affecting our ability to go to school, to study, to get jobs, to be integrated into society. We were beginning to paint the picture that the media and society didn't have of us. And I think that visualization was and still is very important, because there are, now we're in 2020, we say there are 61 million disabled people in the United States, 1 billion disabled people in the world. The picture that people still have around disability, I believe non-disabled people, is one of fear. One of, what would I do if I had this type of a disability? And that's what we're really, in part, also saying. We need to continue to act together to go beyond the ADA and beyond 504. We need to be looking at issues like home and community-based services, the ability to get personal assistance, so that people are not living in these congregate settings. We're in the middle of COVID, and the numbers of people who are dying in nursing homes and other congregate living settings are not really discussed as the death of disabled people who are living in confined, segregated settings. We just kind of talk about it as people in nursing homes. We don't explain why people are in nursing homes or in congregate living programs. And the disability community as a cross-disability movement is really, one, has always spoken out against these congregate programs, has really talked about them as isolating and segregating, again, society not viewing it that way. And so together, I'm hoping that as we move forward out of COVID, that people will also begin to start thinking about would they have wanted to be in any of those settings? Would they want their mother or their father or their sister or brother being put at risk of death?
What was the picture that you and your friends were trying to paint for people in society around, 'cause obviously the way we perceive things is what, frames and shapes things that outcomes like policy, right? So what was the core way you were trying to frame?
We wanted and we want, because it's not a past tense. We wanted and we want people to see us like them. We want people to see that policies on daycare, which didn't exist 20, 30 years ago, where businesses now are setting up daycare programs so that family members can work and have a safe place for their kids. We want them to see personal assistance services, the ability of someone like myself to be able to have someone who I can hire and gets paid an appropriate wage with my money and or government's money. We want them to see that not as something which is hidden, but where we see it as an essential part of life for people on a permanent basis, on a temporary basis, whatever it may be. We want people to see sign language interpreters and people who may need support in the community because of another form of disability as something which is liberating and allowing an increasing number of us to really participate. We want people to see that our absence adversely affects their lives, because it frequently means that they're hiding their own disabilities because they have a hidden disability and they're afraid of discussing it, or other members of their family are being hidden, even if it's not intentional. But if people can't get out of their homes for whatever reason, they're being hidden. And we want people to see the value of diversity, including disabled people who come from every racial background, every sexual orientation, all socioeconomic backgrounds, religions, etc. We want them to be missing in picture of the United States the absence of disability.
What was the significance of both 504 and the ADA?
The impact is slow. We're talking about the built environment, and beyond that, we're talking about people really looking for us. So I would say for myself today, I notice if something is all white. I notice when there is racial diversity and religious diversity, women with head covers, men with yarmulkes, people who are gay and straight. I notice when I don't see that on television programs or in advertising. And so for me, it's striking how we've made amazing, in my view, advances in advertising. So I watch television, I watch ads. I think ads are important, even though a lot of people don't like to watch them. But I do think they're a reflection on the changes in society. And really, there's been a big explosion of diversity in so many of our ads. But when it comes to seeing disabled people or hearing the word mentioned, it's still very minimal. So the effect of the laws, I think, are greater and greater in a positive way on lives of the 61 million disabled people and their friends and family, because we can do more things together. But things like employment, even before COVID, such a huge discrepancy in the number of disabled people employed versus the number of working age people in the non-disability community being employed. Not a fire alarm going off in the general society about why are these people not able to work. One is because of job discrimination, employment discrimination, but part of it also is lack of supports for some people, like personal assistance services, accessibility for transportation, on and on. And then I think it continues to be that hiring managers, if you have two people equally qualified and one has a disability, and the other doesn't, and we could say, let's say one has a disability, the other doesn't, but they're women and they're black or Latino or whatever, it is still more likely that the non-disabled person will be hired. And I think that's really because of lack of exposure. I also think, it is not uncommon to hear hiring managers say, well, what if the disabled person doesn't work out? It will be hard for us to let them go. It's hard to let anybody go, right? Good hiring means your objective is not to fire, but it doesn't always work out. And one should feel that if someone has to get let go and they were a good person to hire and you've done what you need to do, then you treat a disabled person like a non-disabled person. But I think this lack of exposure also really results in fear, not only of becoming like us and fear of having a disability, but it's also this pity, not treating people equally. I believe that more people are really understanding that we're talking about the concept of universal design. By universal design, I don't mean just the physical environment, but universality of needs that people have, and not looking at needs of disabled people as being something that's always different from the general population. And the ADA itself's definition is very broad in defining who has a disability. So it really goes beyond the definition. And the reason why I think about it from a universal perspective is, when you think about Flint, Michigan, as an example, with the contamination of the water, for those individuals who would, as a result of that contamination, have intellectual disabilities, brain injuries, other types of conditions, they would be protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act if they experience an act of discrimination. But I think one of the broader issues that we're trying to look at is not necessarily looking at everything around disability. So we're concerned about the environment, like pollution causes asthma and heart disease and other things like that. But we shouldn't be just looking at the impact of the environmental tragedies that are going on. We need to be looking as societies at preventing it. And we're not doing it to prevent disability. We're doing it to preserve the earth. We're doing it to preserve our lives. And as a result of that, you will see less things like asthma, for example. So we're needing to, as a society, really reconceptualize who we are on this planet and what responsibilities we have as individuals inhabiting the planet. From a disability perspective, our numbers going up also means that we have a larger population of people to draw on who can be speaking as disabled individuals about what they may need now to support themselves and their families. So if someone had a job in the past that now they're no longer able to perform, you want to be able to look at what to do to get a person back into their field or into another field. You want to see them as being able to be productive members of society. I think in the disability community, one of the big issues is we are not represented verbally, visually, in the United States or around the world. So between 61 million and 1 billion disabled people, many of us don't have visible disabilities, but we're not talking about our disabilities. We're not talking about, we see ourselves in many ways as the problem, or we feel ashamed, or family members or others make us feel that way. And I think one of the important parts of the disability rights movement, the human rights and civil rights movement, is casting that aside and saying that we as individuals and as groups of disabled people and as a disability community have the right to be able to live within our society, being a part of change within our society, improving our communities and the world, and we cannot be excluded. Our stories need to be told.
And how does society benefit from everyone's full participation?
I mean, I think that's an how does society benefit from everyone's participation is a very important question, and it goes way beyond disability. If we believe that every life is of value, whether you're black or brown or indigenous, whatever, then you're looking at what is the adverse effect of not having everyone be included. If you believe that not everyone should benefit, that one group has privilege over the other, you're going to look at it differently. For me, I've been very impacted by the Black Lives Matter movement this year, in particular because of the horrendous things that have happened, and because of the power of the voices of black and brown leaders who have been talking about the historical discrimination over centuries that people have experienced, that many, including myself, while I knew some things, I didn't know everything. The stories like that of disabled people who are black and brown and have different disabilities, those stories must be told so that people can be impacted and understand both the terrible atrocities that are being committed on a daily basis against disabled individuals, and as a society, what we wish to do about that, working in collaboration with the disability community to make that happen.
So I know we're running close to time here, so just a couple of closing questions. You've been on the front lines of this fight for a long time. Are we making progress, and where do you think we're headed?
So I've been involved in the movement my whole life. As I got older, I got more involved, as much out of necessity as how I also get empowered by working with other disabled people and allies who share a similar vision for what we wish to be accomplishing. We have definitely been making strides forward. I am very concerned about the impact of COVID, not just on the individual lives of disabled people and the general society, but because of the tragic impact of COVID and the economic implications of COVID in the United States and around the world, it is going to mean more than ever that we ensure that disabled individuals are a conscious group being discussed as we are reforming our communities, as children and adults are beginning to go back to school, as jobs are going to be changing, some disappearing, others being created. As we look at how we are going to be interacting with each other, I'm hoping in part that the dramatic impact of COVID will in fact enable the broader society to look at who has been most adversely affected and why we need to broaden our circle that is inclusive of all people, including those of us with disabilities. And I think in the United States and around the world, but certainly in the United States, the elections coming up this year in 2020 are going to be critically important, and I believe that the voices of disabled individuals are really coming forward in a stronger way. Each election, I think we've become more empowered, and I think that ultimately will be important if we are holding candidates who are running for office responsible for ensuring that government policies and budgets are inclusive, including those of us with disabilities. So the changing reality of disability in America is the changing reality of America. And I think, honestly, COVID is changing our reality in a way that we didn't anticipate. So, on the one hand, I very much feel that the Americans with Disabilities Act has really been having an increasing impact on the lives of disabled individuals, more of whom are feeling empowered and recognizing their self-worth and the importance of them coming forward and playing a bigger role within society. And I do believe that that is having a positive impact on the society overall. At the same time, because of the emergency and urgency of COVID, I really want to make sure that the strength that we've been gaining is maintained, and that we really are able to ensure that as we move forward, disability in a more prominent way will be included in our activities to help advance our society coming out of this tragedy.